On today's episode, we have Dr. Brendan Kieran Browne, Associate Professor in the School of Religion at Trinity College Dublin, and Dr. John Reynolds, Associate Professor in the School of Law from the University of Maynooth.
That's right. They're here to talk to us today about international law, human rights, colonization and colonialism, academic activism, and what all law academics are doing and should be doing to help stop the genocides happening right now, especially in Palestine, but also Sudan, Congo, Ethiopia, etc.
And both of you have research expertise and experience activism for the Palestinian people. So we'll begin with a quick overview of each of you and your research, and then move into the field of activism. Brendan, you've been specifically researching the Palestinian experience for years, and you've taught in the past at Al-Quds in Palestine. Can you give us a brief overview?
Yeah, so as you say, I've been working on and for Palestine now for the best part of 15 years. I first went to Palestine in 2009. My friend was doing some work at a place called Al Jalazon refugee camp outside Ramallah. He invited me over to see what the lay of the land was, and because I'd had a background in human rights, I did my LLM there at Queen's. I was particularly interested in issues around, forced displacement, issues around human rights violations, and all the stuff I was being taught. I wanted to really see how that sort of how that was playing out and manifesting in Palestine. So I went over and visited him. And the minute you go to Palestine, anybody that's been will know that it is something that just grabs you and takes you all the way in. And you can't but help feel completely disgusted and aghast at all the violations that are happening around you. So in the aftermath of that, I decided to do a PhD that wasn't necessarily legally based. It was in the School of Sociology there at Queen's, but it was looking at issues around political ritual and commemoration and how people dealt with the past, comparing Irish Republican commemoration with the commemoration of the Nakba. And it was there that I was based doing field work, and then subsequently decided to return to Palestine in 2015 and take up that position you referenced there, which was as an assistant professor in international law at the Al-Quds University in occupied Jerusalem, where I taught for a year. And again, that was a hugely impactful moment because I was teaching the law of armed conflict. I was teaching humanitarian law, all the rules that are supposed to guide how war and lawfare takes place, to students who were being impacted by violations every day. I had to sit in the classroom and try and teach this stuff with a straight face. And it became increasingly clear to me that there's something fundamentally wrong with doing that, something really at its core that didn't sit well with me. And to be fair, it was my students in the classroom at the time who really pushed me to think deeper about this. And specifically, my work is interested in transitional justice. I'm growing up in Belfast, we're in a space where dealing with the past has been something that we've been doing for the best part of 26 years now, and relatively unsuccessfully, I think. So I was quite interested to see how transitional justice interventions were also being imposed upon the people in Palestine as a way of trying to secure what were seen as attempts at peace building. So I became very interested in that, and then I used that as a source of my analysis of international law, and ever since, as I say, that has been my area of focus. And I guess alongside that, I mean, you referenced the activism. I think for me, my activism is very much about finding ways of influencing the spaces that I am in, if that makes sense. So as a pedagogue, as an educator, I think it's absolutely critical that my activism is pivoted towards disseminating information in a way to students that helps them critique the violence of international law, the colonial underpinnings of international law, the way that law is used as a tool of appeasement, a tool of silencing, the way that law is actually inherently designed to uphold and maintain positions of power. And so my activism is, okay, of course, we engage in things like demonstrations and public events and talks, but for me, it's very much about finding a way of challenging the spaces that I find myself in. And so increasingly, that is something that I've been particularly focused on. So yeah, so that's my sort of engagement with Palestine, engagement with international law, and engagement with activism.
Oh, thanks for that. Now, John, you also research Palestine, colonialism, apartheid, human rights violations, and problems with international law. Can you give us a brief overview of what your work's doing?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having us on. And yeah, like just listening to Brendan there, like not, a little bit of similar background in one sense. Like I spent 3 years in Palestine as a researcher working with human rights organizations after doing my master's studies and before I started my PhD. And so I was working primarily with Al-Haq in Ramallah, but also worked quite closely on a number of projects with Adalah in Haifa and with Badil in Bethlehem and a number of other organizations there. And like apart from what Brendan was talking about, like just the significance of the impact and that thing of not being able to unsee what you've seen once you're there, and being outraged and also inspired at the same time to work on these issues. The thing that really struck me, because with particularly the legal Palestinian rights organizations, they are stuck, they're dealing every day with the contradictions of how, our mandate and mission is to try and use these human rights standards that are supposed to be universal and supposed to help for struggles for egalitarianism and justice in the world, while seeing and being faced with the contradictions every day of doing that in a colonial apartheid occupation regime, whether that's Adalah trying to go to the Israeli courts and the colonizers' courts and make subversive or anti-colonial arguments within the straitjacket of the system and judiciary there, or whether it's the organizations in the West Bank and Gaza that are trying to also leverage some of the international institutions and bring their stories, their arguments, their evidence to international institutions as well. And they're very well aware of the contradictions of doing that, the difficulties and the structural obstacles that are there. But there's a serious amount of self-reflection as well that they're engaged in internally, as well as the way they do their work externally. And so I learned a huge amount from that about the problems of the system itself, obviously, but also how to try and think about engaging tactically within the limitations of the system, and how to try and connect legal work and tactical legal actions and interventions with some kind of wider strategy towards liberation, or political strategy, if we want to put it in that context. And obviously there's a huge amount of pitfalls in doing that, and there's fragmentation between different movements and factions and so on. But as with any anti-colonial struggle, these are the things that you have to navigate. And so I took a lot of that with me, I suppose, coming back to Ireland to do my PhD. And my PhD was not my research at that time. I was still working on projects and papers and stuff on continuing on what I'd been working on in Palestine, but my PhD research was on colonial legal history and the impacts of particular colonial legal systems on international law today, and to try and really just dig deep into this. We all can say, well, international law is colonial and has these colonial origins, and there's a huge amount of work that's been done on the various historical forms that's taken. My work was particularly on emergency legal powers and emergency law, and again, a lot of that was drawing on what I had seen in Palestine, the way the British emergency regulations were used for internment without trial, for administrative detention, for maintaining a hold on political prisoners, on movement restrictions, and all the rest of it. And obviously a lot of that, there's a huge amount of colonial migration around the empire, the way these laws and orders and governance regimes travel. And so that brought me to the kind of school and approach and tradition of international law that I work with a lot, which is third world approaches to international law, which is trying to think about international law with that anti-colonial tradition and orientation. And it's a continuation in some forms of some of the work that was being done in the 60s and 70s by jurists and diplomats and representatives of the third world states in the UN, trying to push for recognition of national liberation movements and their rights to resist, to self-determination and so on, coalescing around the anti-apartheid movement at the time. But also there was a lot of the UN discourse and struggles at that time were connecting the anti-apartheid movement in solidarity with Southern Africa to Zionism and colonial occupation in Palestine, and also to the lingering, what was left of the European empires and Portuguese colonialism particularly. And so there was moves there to articulate an anti-colonial vision of international law. There was also the attempts to inaugurate a new international economic order to try and break the kind of hegemony of Western capitalism and neo-colonial extractivism and these systems that were surviving post-independence of the colonies. And that got, it made some progress and got so far, but ultimately came up against the counter reactionary kind of forces of imperialism, and then the kind of onset of the really kind of heavy neoliberal tendencies and institutions at the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and the World Bank, and all of the conditions that they imposed, which were really designed to maintain and extend the global hierarchies and inequalities that had been there previously. And so when I started studying international law as an undergraduate, which was around the time of the Iraq War and the War on Terror, that just made a lot of sense to me, and helped me to understand a lot of those contradictions and the violence of international law, as Brendan put it. And then going on into the 2008 period and the financial crisis, which was when I was starting to do my postgraduate and PhD work, one of the main thinkers and figures in third world approaches to international law in this post 1990s period is Tony Anghie. And he talks about how, for a lot of, for most of the world, if we talk about the tricontinental sphere of Africa and Asia and Latin America, for most of the world and most students of law and international relations, this is just common sense to talk about colonial inequalities, neo-colonial structures, and so on. But at that point, at least in the West, and certainly in my undergraduate law education in Ireland, that wasn't present at all, and would have been seen for a long time as quite fringe and marginal. But that has been changing significantly through the last 10 or 15 years. And so that's part of the projects I'm involved in with journals and publication and dissemination work, and also with teaching. And you see, the students and newer generations of postgrads and younger scholars now, there's a real appetite and thirst for this, because it just makes a lot more sense to anyone that's looking around the world with their eyes open, and explains things and helps to understand things a lot better than just going through rehearsing the sources and histories of international law from a very Eurocentric perspective that tell us there was periods of lawlessness and violence, and then international law and human rights came along and brought us on this progressive journey to now a modern world without violence and impunity as it existed in the past, which obviously just doesn't stack up.
That's great, John. A couple of things coming out of that. Maybe you might talk a little bit more about how bringing it into the classroom in that practical sense. I know one of the things that your research focuses on is Israeli apartheid. And I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about that, the analysis and the arguments that you've been making in relation to that, and how it informs your teaching, maybe?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of elements maybe to apartheid I can speak about. One is about apartheid in international law itself, and what do we mean by that, and how do we apply that framework to Israel. Another then is about, so I suppose what you could think about as the politics and the discourses around apartheid, or the apartheid debates, and how that's evolved since the end of formal apartheid in Southern Africa, and how we understand and conceptualize what apartheid was then and there, and what it is now in Palestine or in anywhere else we may want to think about that, because there is an ongoing, like with all of these international law debates, it is a site of contestation, and there are ebbs and flows to the argument. And it is interesting. I'll speak maybe the third point then to answer your question about teaching, but it is interesting just teaching now to student cohorts that were not around at all, were born after the end of apartheid in South Africa, and to see how they view it when we talk about apartheid and what it was in South Africa, to see how they view that and read that today in the context of the world around them. So just like very briefly on the first point, like, so I suppose the fundamental point and what the research project that I started out doing this nearly 20 years ago was on the back of a report by John Dugard when he was the special rapporteur on Palestine. John Dugard was a international lawyer from South Africa involved in anti-apartheid work over the course of the 70s and 80s there, and then a prominent international law person in UN spaces after that. And he made this point that the Israeli occupation had characteristics not just of occupation and systemic human rights violations, but potentially also of apartheid and colonialism. And he made that point in a series of reports around 2006-7. And on the back of that, there was a big research project commissioned by Ronnie Kasrils, who was another ANC anti-apartheid figure who was a minister in the South African government at that time, and the South African Research Council commissioned this study, which I and many other Palestinian and international lawyers and researchers were involved in. And ultimately, it was about applying the definition of apartheid in international law to the Israeli state, and the very clear conclusions was that Israel is an apartheid state, does apply an apartheid regime in historic Palestine throughout the territories, but also in its kind of projection of a globalized kind of racial order that discriminates between what are described or defined as Jewish nationals anywhere in the world that have automatic migration and citizenship and residency rights in historic Palestine versus Palestinian refugees and displaced people who are excluded entirely from that. And so you have the localized forms of segregation, racial domination in similar ways that you had to apartheid in Southern Africa. You also then have these what we could call the grand apartheid elements of the creation of territorial reserves and the fragmentation of the territory equivalent to the Bantustan project in Southern Africa, and as well as what I mentioned there is the kind of border apartheid regime as well. And so all that combines to impose what is the definition of apartheid, which is an institutionalized and systemic form of racial domination by one group over another. And a lot of the background analysis of that, as it was being discussed, what I mentioned, the anti-apartheid resolutions and motions in the UN in the 60s and 70s, making connections to Palestine, that was tied to some of the thinking and ideas and analysis that was being done by Fayez Sayegh and others at the PLO Research Center in Beirut, doing these quite detailed analysis of Zionism as racism and of Israel as an apartheid state. And so there was a very strong anti-colonial analysis to the idea of Israeli apartheid all through the 70s and 80s and that period. And so we were drawing on that and bringing that into like a more formalistic argument in international law. And on the back of these studies that started to be done after John Dugard had raised it, the Russell Tribunal on Palestine had a session on this and found Israel to be practicing apartheid, and then it went on into some of the UN human rights committees and mechanisms, and more recently the likes of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, as well as some of the Jewish Israeli organizations making these findings of Israeli apartheid. But one of the things, and this is to the second point about the discourses around it, one of the things that I have, some of us have been conscious of trying to point out, and including many Palestinian scholars like Lana Tatour and Noura Erakat and others, that there is, it's important to be attentive to the detail of the history and the conceptualization of apartheid, not just as this aggravated form of racial discrimination, but as a manifestation and an inherent derivative of a settler colonial regime. And apartheid is one form that the settler colonial project takes as a form of management and governance and practical imposition of logics of domination and elimination. But there is, and this is reflective of a wider tendency in human rights and international law standards, that's, as things become more universal and liberal, some of that anti-colonial essence gets stripped out of them. And so one of the things I was looking at was the difference between the definition of apartheid in the 1973 Apartheid Convention, which was very much a third world project, versus the definition of apartheid in the 1998 Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, which is more of a Western-led project. And there, you know, if the ultimate essence about racial domination is still there in both, but if you look more closely, the apartheid later definition for the ICC, a lot of the elements about land, colonization, territorial carving out Bantustans, reserves and ghettos and so on is stripped out of it, and it's more about physical violent acts and murder and killing to impose racism and racial domination, and some of the underpinnings gets dropped out. And for Palestinians that is important because you know what the response to apartheid looks like is shaped by how we understand apartheid. And if we talk about it as racism but not as colonialism, that does create a different framework for remedies and reparations. And so that's, you know, with this coming up in submissions being made to the International Criminal Court, the International Criminal Court being asked to investigate not just Israeli war crimes but also Israeli apartheid and colonial structural crimes as well, which so far the ICC has avoided touching, but part of the Palestinian submissions are about pushing it to do so. And you know, that's in that broader context of addressing the situation as a whole and not just, you know, the most violent or egregious forms of or that it takes. And just on your last point then about teaching, I mean, I think it is, you know, I teach a course as well as international law. I also do teach a course about law and racism, which is not specific to international law, but we look at the relationships between law and race and racism historically, and we talk about slavery and about colonialism, but also about apartheid in South Africa as a very, you know, as one of the most explicit forms of state and institutional racism being adopted as formal government policy and imposed. And you know, a lot of Black Irish students and students of colour in the class who would be quite well aware about, you know, racial injustice and racial violence and police violence in the US or in Britain or other reference points today. You know, it's quite stark to see for many students across the board how you know how shocked and surprised and taken aback they are to just go through some of the basic chronology and histories and realities of what apartheid in South Africa was. And so even though we're only one generation on from that, and even though there's still, you know, a neo-apartheid or massive social and economic equality still based on race in South Africa, even if formal apartheid has ended, and this is still very much a live issue, as we see, you know, with everything that's been happening with the US, the Trump executive orders against South Africa and all the rest of it. You know, there is, it really brings it home, I suppose, the importance of, you know, teaching these histories, teaching the traditions of resistance against them, and what, you know, the anti-apartheid movement was about in South Africa, how that extended globally, and what we can learn from that for other struggles today.
Thanks, John. That was a lot. And Brendan, I'll come back to you. There's all sorts of points we can now jump off from that John's given us.
Yeah, and I think the first thing is to say, you know, people like John and some of the other people he named, like Nuada and Lana, have really done so much of the heavy lifting that we owe them an immense debt of gratitude when it comes to our thinking on this. But John will also know him and I don't probably share the exact same, I don't want to say optimism that the system itself can provide some kind of repair or justice-oriented future. I think that's probably where we probably disagree. I mean, I do think it's really important, as John mentioned, and I am going to largely say a lot of what John said as well. I do think it's really important that we find definitional clarity and that we have something to hang our hook on. You know, it's really important. People need these tangible descriptions and these tangible historical moments that they can refer back to. And I think with the apartheid framing that John's talked about, that has been super critical. But I think, you know, I used to think that transitional justice, for example, could conceive of a way of managing a lot of these issues. I used to say that transitional justice could be radicalized to sort of provide a decolonial future, some kind of justice-oriented future in the case of Palestine. But I've actually got to the stage where I don't believe there is any liberation to be found within the language of international law whatsoever. I think international law, as I said at the beginning, is inherently unmalleable to the extent that what we are looking for in the context of Palestine cannot be found in the existing frameworks and the existing language. And a lot of the Palestinian comrades that I would be in constant conversation with and in constant discourse with around, what does the future look like, around what repair looks like, around the imagined futures, I would say, have said that they actually chastise us for believing that international law can provide these frameworks. I've been accused on occasions of gaslighting people by saying, the language of the ICC perhaps can help us, and I think it's also in some ways that we're desperate to find some kind of positive outcome. I think I'm not trying to let ourselves off the hook here, but I think we are desperate to see these institutions find these people accountable for the most egregious crimes. But history would dictate actually that's not going to happen. And so I wonder if we're at the moment of time now, if we are actually standing on a precipice where it's incumbent upon international lawyers, even those who are the most radical, to actually fundamentally disengage from the conversations that suggest that there's any liberation to be had within these structures, and to say, well, what is a radically different structure that we can consider? And again, this is the massive cop-out here. I don't know the answer to this, of course. I'm not in those spaces for those conversations either, but I do think we're at that stage where we need to be looking beyond that. So I'm not sure if we hugely disagree, John. I'm sure you would agree with a lot of what I'm saying, but and again, as I say, it's a bit of a cop-out by not being able to provide the framework for it. But I just don't feel the positivity at this moment in time that there's something that's going to come from this.
I think we fundamentally are on the same page. I suppose it's a question about the contours of it. Like because I have no optimism or faith in international law to provide the liberation for Palestinians or anyone else. I suppose the question is, if we're talking about, well, the responsibility of international lawyers to disengage completely from that space, that's fine. But I do think then you need to be clear about where you're going, and if you're disengaging, then you're not an international lawyer anymore. And if you're going to another field of analysis, fair enough. If you're going and talking about, organizing at whatever levels of social movements or armed struggle or whatever it is, that's all. These are all part of the overall struggle as I would see it. And I think if you think about the history of anti-colonial struggles and the likes of whether it's the anti-apartheid movements in South Africa and Namibia, so on, whether it's the FLN in Algeria, no one was under any illusions about international law providing the answers, or an international court being the one that would ultimately deliver justice, quote unquote. But there was, and I think, if the likes of, for example, the SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization, and the liberation movement in Namibia is interesting to study, because there was a whole series of attempts to engage the International Court of Justice on the question of Namibian self-determination and emancipation from apartheid, which produced some of the most conservative and white supremacist inflected judgments from the ICJ itself in the earlier phase, but ultimately did get an ICJ judgment to say Namibia has the right to self-determination and to be free from apartheid South Africa's rule. That was in 1971, and nobody, the SWAPO weren't expecting that. Now that the International Court of Justice has said that, the apartheid regime is just going to leave and let us be free. And what was interesting, their response to the judgment was not to say, well, now we have to use this judgment to do advocacy at the UN or try and convince the apartheid regime that they have to follow this. The immediate set of actions they took were general strikes and mass civil disobedience on the back the judgment, as well as, you know, feeding into the other elements of the liberation struggle. And it was, you know, an understanding of the document of international law, not as an end in itself, but as a means to mobilize other forms of struggle, as tying in with, you know, as thinking about, like what Richard Falk always talks about as the legitimacy war as one element of the wider struggle. There is, you know, an element about propaganda ultimately, and making the argument as persuasive and appealing and convincing for as wide of a section of the people and the population itself involved in the struggle, as well as the support from abroad, from your own community in exile, from international social movements and institutions as well. And so, you know, I think it's not to disagree with anything that you've said, but like what I think, say, if we talk about the South Africa case against Israel at the accusing of genocide in the ICJ, you know, again, I don't think any Palestinians were under any illusions that would stop the genocide in itself. It was, you know, there was one element of the narrative which was about this as an anti-colonial challenge in a historically colonial institution to one of the, you know, imperial powers' main fronts in the region, and that is significant in and of itself. There's another narrative that, you know, people like Majd Kyle, who was writing about this at the time, talking about all this does is show us the sorcery of international law. It shows us that it, you know, has this appearance of being able to do these magic things like stop a genocide or impose a ceasefire, but actually it's just performing a kind of set of witchcraft and wizardry to trick us into thinking it can do more than it actually can. And so, you know, there's different views of this within the Palestinian movement and within the solidarity movements. And I think, you know, ultimately it's about, you know, the contours of the tactical struggle. How is there a way that you can see any of this as useful in fitting into the wider struggle or not? And if not, you know, I think, you know, your point about looking for the alternatives and departing altogether is fair enough. But there is, you know, I suppose one of it, and, you know, even within third world approach to international law, there's huge spectrum here between, you know, the most kind of militant Marxist and anti-imperialist analysis, which would say it's absolutely beyond redemption and there's no point in engaging, to others who would say, you know, it's obviously, you know, a site of historic and ongoing colonial violence, but it's a system and a set of institutions that exist, and if we depart the arena altogether, it just vacates it for the imperial powers to do more with it. And this idea that, you know, if you don't do international law will do you. And that is, you know, again, part of the tactical considerations that movements and lawyers have to think about. And that's at the international law setting. It's also in sometimes, you know, some of maybe the most interesting possibilities are also in national courts or domestic courts. And if you think about the way Jacques Vergès and other lawyers for the FLN and the Algerian movement try to use strategies and tactics of rupture, as he called it, to turn the French use of law against the Algerians back on itself, and to use the courtroom as a space for anti-colonial performance and drama and politics. And, you know, there's some of that, you know, we can think about whether, you know, anything that's happening at the moment, the case to argue for Hamas to be deprescribed in Britain, or, you know, even the way NECAP may or may not kind of use the legal case against them to kind of try and invert the argument. There's, you know, potentially some space there for law within this, you know, wider narrative of struggle.
Thanks, John. Yeah, a lot. We've covered a lot about the research. So let's move on to activism, a big part of the series here. So Brendan, let's start with you. Can you talk us through what sort of activism can we do after being told about how terrible everything is? What can we do?
I think I agree with a lot of what John is saying, by the way, and I think it's really important to have that level of analysis as well. And I do understand that point about pivoting law in pursuit of other goals and not seeing it as the be all and end all, not seeing it as this panacea that's going to solve everything. I still feel a little bit that we're at this stage of wondering, do we need more people to maybe disassociate completely and think of something radically and fundamentally different? Because it is difficult to not feel that we're being contained as a movement at this moment in time, and that law provides the framework of containment in a very useful way by giving us tidbits, by presenting us with little bits of perceived wins, and again, it requires us to constantly be accepting of some of the limitations, I think, and again, maybe that's me just being a bit of a purist on that, but I totally accept what John says, and we just yeah. So your question, Stephen, was about the activism, and I guess it kind of returns me back to what I said at the very beginning, which is a nice circling back point, which was about how do we, in the spaces that we find ourselves in, impact change and meaningful change. And again, I said that was through pedagogy. For me, is really where I think that my role in the struggle is most useful at this moment in time. It's about bringing honest appraisals of what it is that we're teaching into the spaces that we find ourselves in. Okay, so really critiquing what is being taught, what the underlying biases are, what the racial underpinnings are. And it's also about being really brave and determined with the use of our language. I mean, you know, we're preaching to the choir a little bit here. Obviously, we're all in the same hymn sheet, but there's plenty of international lawyers I know. There's plenty of lawyers in general will be very uneasy with the conversations around anti-colonial resistance. They'll be very uncomfortable with platforming conversations around armed struggle as legitimate. They'll be very uncomfortable with bringing that conversation into the classroom, whether or not it's done through a legal framing or not. And I do think we need to be braver when it comes to our language and what we're prepared to say. That's the first thing. And there's a wonderful scholar, Palestinian poet, activist, just educator in general, who we'll all be familiar with, Mohammed El-Kurd. And he used the term recently that our role as comrades and as colleagues and as activists and pedagogues and whatever is to raise the bar of what is permissible. Right. And I think that's a lovely way to frame it, is raise the bar of what is permissible to talk about. And that is our role as I say, as comrades from afar, is to do some of the heavy lifting, to give people the intellectual scaffolding to challenge existing norms. You know, it's no longer, we should be very unashamedly and clearly and determinedly calling out those who call themselves decolonial, international legal scholars, and who actually do very, very little to demonstrate any of that whatsoever. And we all know those people. I'm not going to name check any, but we all know people. We all know people who are in the spaces, and we hear them talking about decolonial this and decolonial that, but it's always done in a way that is hugely abstract, and it's disassociated completely with any sense of praxis or any sense of meaningful action. And I think it is on us. If we're prepared to put our necks on the line, then we have to also call out those that are shirking their responsibility. We literally cannot reduce decolonial work to metaphorical intervention. It cannot be the case. And unfortunately, again, like with many other linguistic traps that have been set for lots of different people over different periods of time, I do feel that the language of decolonization has been completely liberalized, completely softened. The sharp edges have been taken off it. So I think that's our role as activists, as radical scholars, as critical scholars, is to ensure that we do not allow those people to go unchallenged. We have to always ensure that there is practical application to what it is that we're teaching. And as I said, look, I'm not in the game of naming people, but I just do not understand how we can get to a stage where people who have taught in the fields of international law or transitional justice or whatever can attend international law conferences in sites of ongoing settler colonial erasure, as was happening in the last 2 years. I mean, we know this is taking place, but we have to be brave in our spaces and consistent to say this is not okay and this shouldn't be allowed to happen, and to ensure that the spaces that we provide are not occupied by these kind of cultish personality, big name legal types, and that's a problem. The other thing is we just need to always deplatform genocide deniers, deplatform racists. Do not allow them to be brought into our pedagogy, because that is the reproduction. They allow the reproduction of this violence and these norms that sort of keep us trapped in our thinking when it comes to how to do something better. So look, that's just how I see it. I see it as us in the spaces that we find ourselves in, being brave and consistent, using language that isn't softened to appease liberal sensitivities, framing it carefully as the way I think John does expertly, framing it carefully within the language that is there already, fine, if that's the language that we're going to use, and then being bold enough to think about something even better and bigger in the future. I think that's what we need to do at this moment in time.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that, and I think anyone that hasn't read Mohammed Al-Kurd's book should very much do so, because he really does articulate it very powerfully, but also poetically. Maybe just on one space of activism, just to pick up on that, like if we talk about our own spaces in the academic world, and just to maybe talk a little bit about the academic boycott and academic activism as one form of that. And it just, like when Brendan was talking there about the decolonial international lawyers and decolonial scholars, and their silences and inaction, and some of those, I think we've all been in those spaces or conversations where just the dissonance is just literally defies belief, and just fresh in my mind because I think it's just come out again recently, and I think you'll probably be well aware of this as historians, but like every year the Dan David Prize, when the winners of the Dan David Prize, which is this history prize that's basically an Israeli institutional award, there's a number of historians that are given this big award every year, and without fail every year there's at least a few that identify as post-colonial or decolonial historians, or historians of race and empire, or some version of that, who are ultimately defending their position, sometimes explicitly, sometimes refusing to say anything about it, but clearly have made a conscious decision to accept this award in breach of requests from Palestinian colleagues and all of that. And it really just is incredible that we're still in that, in the after 20 months of genocide at this point. But I think if we think about the other side of it, like we've as the work we've been doing with Academics for Palestine since it was set up in Ireland in 2014, a lot of that has been, as well as being around promoting Palestinian scholarship and analysis and so on. A core focus of the work is around academic boycott and divestment, and kind of building understanding and awareness and support for the PACB position in the Irish higher education sector. And so I think it is significant what and Brendan would know a lot more about the all of the work that's gone into this in Trinity over the last 10 years or more to get to the point where Trinity has taken this position now on divestment and committing not to enact any future partnerships. And that that is a testament to activism of many intersecting stripes, and obviously the student movement and the continuous kind of efforts of the Trinity Students' Union and the Trinity BDS campaign, which is not an easy thing to sustain over 10 or more years, given how transient student cohorts are, and the fact that you have every couple of years new people coming in, new people moving on, and that has been a major struggle for the student movements in most of the Irish universities. And so for Trinity to have been able to sustain things to the extent they have at that level, and then to build the necessary kind of support among staff unions, researchers, and ultimately force the management into this position, which a couple of years ago they just there was absolutely no horizon for that at all. And that has it's shameful and shameless that it takes a genocide for it to get to that point, but it's also not a given, and it takes a huge amount of mobilizing and organizing, and a lot of the difficult but necessary tedious work at various university committees and all the rest of it to build up to that position. And so I do think it is important to acknowledge that all the work that's gone into that in Trinity, and and the importance that of the precedent and the example that sets for the rest of the universities on the island as well. One of the first things we did in 2 or 3 weeks into the genocide in late October, early November 2023, and Brendan will remember this well, we wrote a very simple, straightforward letter to the editor of the Irish Times that was ultimately signed by more than 1,000 scholars across the island of Ireland in support of a very basic position, calling on the universities to suspend their ties with a state that had been practicing apartheid and colonial occupation for so many decades and was now, in the midst of unleashing a genocide. And the fact that we got such a high degree of support for that in such a short turnaround, I think, is indicative of where people are at on this issue in Ireland. There was, a smaller group, maybe 20 or so scholars who responded with this, very trite kind of claim that this is war and self-defense, and war is not the same as genocide, and trying to dismiss the position. And it's reflective, I suppose, of a certain form of kind of imperial nostalgia and post-colonial hangover that that still is there in some spaces in the Irish academy. But the fact that it was so marginal and so small since then, and like Brendan said, ultimately, and people will know this phrase in the title of the book from Omar al-Akkad, that one day everyone will have been against this. And we already see that with many of those people who were in support of the Israeli aggression at the start, who've now realized or are starting to realize. But it is, like Brendan said, that is, all of this is part of raising the ceiling, pushing things with the clear analysis and with the kind of unapologetic language that needs to be used from the start. And it was very clear to any genocide studies or Holocaust studies scholar at a very early stage, to many international lawyers who were talking about genocide from very early on in the way that they were, hadn't been a central point of analysis in Palestine previously, because of how overt the racist and dehumanizing genocidal language and incitement intent was, combined with the actual destruction and elimination and annihilation that was happening. And it's still 20 months later, it's still, there's so few university administrators or managements or university statements that have been willing to use the language of genocide, and those, even those that have done so are not owning it and saying we're condemning Israel's genocide. They're hiding behind the language of the International Court of Justice and quoting or supporting the ICJ position rather than taking it on themselves. And that's, I think, shows we do still have to keep doing this analysis and keep pushing on it. It also does, on one hand show, on another hand show, again, without wanting to celebrate or anything, that for better or for worse, there is a deference to international legal institutions and international legal language, and so there can be also utility in harnessing that in productive ways to push for those more radical positions that we need to be advancing.
Great, thanks again to both of you for that, and for touching upon so many different things. I think it's one of the things that myself and Stephen, as medieval historians, we work in a very different field or area, but our work would focus on colonialism, settlement, identity, and things like that in the medieval period. And one of the things that we started talking about, exchanging through emails, is like, well, where is everybody? Where are the historians, not just medieval historians, but modern historians, and why aren't more modern historians engaging with activism and with acknowledging even what is happening? So it's great to tease out all of those things for, within the field of academia. I suppose one of the things that we also wanted to talk about today is the Irish government has been very vocal in support of Palestine, but they've actually stalled a lot in terms of the practicalities, for want of a better way of expressing it. When you think about the Occupied Territories Bill, even though I think we're probably beyond that now, but the stall on the Occupied Territories Bill, the use of Shannon Airport. And I was wondering if both of you might just comment on that in terms of Irish neutrality. What can we do? Email the RTDs. What actual actions can we take in relation to Shannon, for example?
First of all, just to say about the Irish government a little bit, I mean, it's an unbelievable feat they've managed to pull off. On the one hand, come across as these, you know, they have this global reputation they've managed to get for being the most pro-Palestine, biggest supporters of Palestine, and yet they're the second largest importer and exporter of Israeli goods and products in Europe. I mean, that is unbelievable when you see it. There was a really important report, or sorry, an article released recently in Counterpunch. I don't know if you saw it. I forget the author's name, which is terrible, but the article just spelt it out so clearly in terms of all the economic ties, in terms of all the support that's being done behind the scenes. So I think that was a wonderful intervention. It was something that provided us with a lot of information that we could share then to our bases and to the people that we're teaching and whatever else. So it's incredible what they've managed to do, and it's real testament, I think. It's real testament to the people of Ireland and those that have been out on the streets, and the various activist groups and the various communities who've just said, absolutely not, we're not taking any of this, not in our name. So fair play to the people with that. I'm not as close to the Shannon situation as, I don't know if John is, but I'm just not as close to that. So I can't really speak too much about it. Obviously, I know what the situation is. I know this is all about the transfer of weapons through Shannon Airport on its way to Israel, and the sort of arguments that are going on behind the scenes. I'm sure John would be able to talk a little bit more about the legal arguments that are being advanced. So with that in mind, I'll just pass over to John. I don't want to waffle too much on that.
Yeah, so I mean, this is I think we've both written about different elements of Ireland's role and responsibilities and complicities here, and this could be a whole discussion of its own, but I suppose maybe just a couple of things. So yeah, the article in the Counterpunch article was Daragh Cogley on Ireland's double game, the anti-colonial rhetoric and the neoliberal imperialism, and Bana Abu Zuluf had a piece recently as well on similar thing about the double move, where she called it between political gaslighting and supply chains and Ireland's complicity in the Gaza genocide. And so I think a lot of this, like so what Brendan mentioned, the figure there, the figures recently. I wrote a piece last year on the Law and Political Economy blog around just about a year ago now, so it would have been summer 2024. And at that point, the data and the figures we had, Ireland was Israel's fourth largest export market in the world at that stage, and it's now, according to the most recent data, is the second largest, and so it's only the US that imports more Israeli goods and services than Ireland does anywhere in the world. And so that, and we can't understand that separate to understanding Ireland's role in global capital supply chains, in the American tech sector, because when you drill down into the detail of it, what are these billions and billions of imports from Israel? The majority of it is electronic components and microchips. And my colleague of mine, Maynooth, and UCD, Paddy Bresnahan and Pat Brody had a good piece in the Examiner on this as well recently, and they're talking about the relationships between the American tech companies that have huge investment and operations in Israel and also in Ireland, obviously. And so when we talk about those supply chains, that is to do with Ireland's role, partly as this kind of part tax haven for American multinationals, and also as part kind of comprador capitalist kind of space for moving money, services, and goods around. And so, we can't understand Ireland's role in this without understanding, where it fits into like Western imperialism in the Middle East, the imperial world system generally, and that also obviously connects to Shannon as well, because the whole story of Shannon, obviously, as we know, started with this agreement that Fianna Fáil had with the American government back at the time of the War on Terror and the invasion of Iraq, and has continued since then with basically free rein being given to the US military to use Shannon as a base and stop off point. And when we see, and it's only I think there's a couple of things that are significant about, what can we do and the type of activism and so on. A couple of things that are really important that are, in the story of Shannon and its role in the genocide. And this is the stop-offs in Shannon, but also it goes to the overflights as well. And on one hand, the government's unwillingness and incapacity to, know what's coming through Irish territory and Irish airspace. It doesn't want to know. And so it's turning a blind eye and it's not checking. It's issuing all of these exemptions and licenses to German and French and American airline companies to use Irish airspace. You know, it's clearly against Irish legislation for any of them to be transporting munitions without a specific license to do so, and it's not, you know, it doesn't have those licenses, but it's still they're still being given permission to travel through. And so the role of the likes of the Ditch and Niall Sargent at the Currency and some of the investigative reporting on this has been really essential. And so part of, you know, what we can do as activists that don't necessarily have the sources or the technological expertise that they have to get hold of flight transcripts and records and to do all the, you know all the nuances of the freedom of information requests and be able to join all the dots together. Even just supporting their work is one very practical and concrete thing we can do. And then it's about, you know, put it like the government for a long time, you know, initially was saying there's no flights coming through, there's nothing stopping at Shannon. They would just deny. Then the reports come out, the evidence is presented by the Ditch. The Ditch are sending them, you know, this flight is coming from Houston, Texas today with these exact munitions parts on the flight. You know, we're giving you advance notice, you have to do something, and they're just avoiding it, turning the other way. And so part of it, but they're not, you know, now they're, you know, at that point then they said, okay, we're going to look into this, we're not sure. And so they were pushed from, you know, the denial to some form of, you know, qualification and trying to deflect, and then comes in the work of, you know, potentially lawyers, and their, you know, Uplift do have this case in the works, and I think the Ditch had also filed some legal complaints or challenges as well. So there is a role, you know, for judicial review and for legal complaints, even to the, you know, for you know what little it might be worth, to make the complaints to the guards and to say, you know, these are or to send the information to the guards. This is, you know, things that you should be investigating, and you're obliged to do so. And so a lot of the, you know, public awareness and education around that, it also feeds into then, you know, the likes of Alice Mary Higgins and others in the Shannon and in the Dáil, who are trying to put forward legislation on Shannon, on arms embargoes, on occupied territories trade, on the Israel bonds sales by the central bank. All of these issues, the more we know about them, the more we can support opposition pushes to highlight them, to get them blocked by legislation, and to put pressure on the government ultimately. Because, you know, we saw in the election that they were sensitive to that. They made a whole load of promises that, you know, ultimately, once they were able to get back into power with the Conservative coalition that they wanted, and without any you know, other smaller party to push them, they, you know, have obviously dropped that and abandoned that as quickly as they could. And it was, you know, very clear with the Occupied Territories Bill, they, you know, it was an empty promise made in the election, and, you know, worked to an extent in duping some of the electorate into voting for them, and they were able to dismiss it or drop it for the first few months. But it has, you know, it's come back again, and I think that the amount of mobilization around this and these kind of legislative and policy efforts do show they can't ignore everything forever, and they can be pushed in certain directions. Obviously, it's nowhere near as far enough, and like Brendan said, like the disconnect between what they say and what they do is so clear and so obvious. But I think, you know, that everybody can see that in the country now. There's no getting away from that. And so, you know, the next phase is just about continuing to push, and it's about, you know, coalitions and coordination between activists and street protests and demonstrations, between the investigative journalists and political education work, the lawyers who may be trying to bring challenges, the legislators who are trying to do stuff internally, and all of that, you know, all of that coming together. And, you know, Ireland is only one small country that doesn't, you know, will say, you know, people will say, well, we don't have any influence, what's the point in pushing? But, you know, it is a very significant pressure point and pressure valve, because of what I said at the start about, you know, that role as a conduit in the bigger political economy and military kind of logistics systems and so on. And so if you can put a spanner in the works, even of one small piece of the machine, that can disrupt the machine itself. But it also, then, you know, there are lots of partners and comrades in other countries looking at, what is going on with the bonds in Ireland. How is that relevant to our situation in Canada or in Chile or wherever else? What can we do that's similar to this, that's learning from the Irish experience? And there is one of the really productive things that is happening at the moment is, those conversations and information sharing and political education between movements across borders and across different geographies that is all in and of itself are only small pieces, but it's about producing that global kind of tidal wave that ultimately is what's needed to dismantle the colonial regime in Palestine.
Thanks, John. Yeah, a lot there. So I think we're gonna start to wrap things up. Just gonna ask both of you for some final thoughts about law, human rights, current issues, because we've covered a lot about like Palestine. It's not the only genocide going on. We also got Sudan and Congo, Ethiopia, etc. So we've talked about coloniality and international law. I think it all ties together. Any final thoughts? Activism. What can academics and regular people listening in do, and how it all ties together?
Yeah, I'll jump in first then, and sure, John, you can have the last word on all of this. I think the key thing is to view all of these as interconnected, as linked together. These are about subjugation and people struggling for self-determination, freedom, and justice, and dignity is the key word I'd like to make sure that we have on the table when we have these conversations as well. And so I don't think it's a massive take-home message to say that these issues are all interlinked, and we are aghast at all of them. Palestine is obviously the one that has been occupying, for want of a better word, my mind for a long period of time, and so that's where my immediate focus is on. But I think the minute we view these things in isolation, we do them an awful disservice. So I think that would be my sort of critical point on that. There are a couple of take-home points I'd like to just put on the table for people listening, and in terms of what we can do as a community of concerned individuals, but also as a growing movement, because I think that's very significant as well. Is never have I seen the energy around the Palestine solidarity movement be as strong and as determined and as focused, which is something I think we can all say is a positive thing and a good thing. So John made reference kindly to the work that was done at Trinity with regard to the BDS and the sort of the gains that had been achieved there, and I think that is something that's very significant and very critical. But that's a comma, because we need to move forward beyond just BDS. It's not just about boycott, divestment, and sanctions in the sense of withdrawing all of our connections with the apartheid state. It's also about finding ways of building connections with our brothers and sisters in Palestine and building those partnerships that are critical for regeneration, regrowth, rebuilding in a way that is genuinely decolonial, genuinely on an equal level. And I think that's something we need to be better at as a movement. I think we need to find better ways of bringing, and we're academics here, so I'll use the academic framing. We need to find better ways of including academics in Palestine in our thinking and in our work in Ireland here. And I know some of us are very good at that, but I think there's a space and a moment to do that. It cannot be the case that we simply say we brought 16 Palestinians over on a scholarship from Gaza for the last 2 years and think that's enough. That's tokenistic. We all agree that that's tokenistic. We need to be better than that. So I'm really glad that we've secured the BDS victories that we've secured, but it's about building. Revolution is about building as well. The other thing I think we need to be very, very careful about in these next steps, and to borrow from Tsepo Madlingozi, he talks about the transitional justice entrepreneurs. We can see them circling at this moment in time because we know that this catastrophic moment will come to an end, and that is when a lot of those people who have been extremely silent and sometimes, dare I say it, complicit by their silence in what has been allowed to happen, they will then seek to engage in ways of containing what a justice-oriented future looks like in and for Palestine. And so I think we need to be very, very cautious about what comes next in that academic sense as well. And that will require, as I mentioned before, I think I've been pretty clear about this, that will require us to be brave as academics to hold other academics accountable. It will require us to determined and steadfast with the language that we use. And equally, we need to be, and if you want to bring some of the international law back onto the table, equally, we need to be careful that we don't allow international law to return us to a pre-October 7th conversation around two states for two peoples, because they were not two equitable realities. If, as we all know, we cannot have a situation where we return to October the 5th, where Palestinians still live subjugated lives, still have the freedom of movement restricted, still have all their rights denied, still are second-class citizens, still have their natural resources poisoned and attacked, still have their land stolen through settlement enterprises, still live under siege. All of this needs to be fundamentally challenged. And if so, international law, if it is to be genuinely pivoted in service of decolonization and liberation in the context of Palestine, I think needs to move beyond what it has provided up until this point when it comes to conversations around statehood and state building. And we are seeing that at this moment in time. We are seeing third-party states talk about recognition, third-party states talk about going to the United Nations to put conversations around Palestinian statehood. And I think we need to be very, very careful about that. So there's a few tangible take-homes from my space, which would be in the sort of conflict and peace building framing. And I hope we can do that. And I think if we can maintain the energy, which is something that's very, very difficult to do, as we all know, but if we can maintain the energy beyond just reacting to this abhorrent situation that we find ourselves in and genuinely build with creativity, I think something better is on the horizon. And I genuinely believe, by the way, something better is on the horizon, even though it's difficult to find the hope at this moment in time.
Yeah, that's great, Brendan. And so maybe just I'd agree with all of that and just pick up on a couple of little points there. So one around the building part, right? Because one of it, I think there's a couple of strands to that. One is about the intellectual analysis and understanding. And so I think clearly, and this is an obvious point, and goes back to Edward Said and many others before, but like, the importance of recognizing and understanding that, the best conceptualizations and theorizations of what, Zionism and Israeli apartheid comes from, the Palestinian thinkers and scholars who've been doing this work for since the very start for decades and decades and decades. And there is, this is a classic, situation of or scenario of the Western Academy kind of extracting from sites of knowledge in quote unquote global South and cherry picking and using research that's done in a way to posit or advance their own theories and will never acknowledge or reference or learn from the important, the important theoretical work that's been done by anti-colonial scholars and thinkers across the decolonized world. And so, and I think part of that, is to, okay, what can we learn from Palestinians and their own analysis themselves, and how can that push us to raise our own ceiling, as we said. Part of it then is like the likes of Chepo that Brendan mentioned, and other critical South African scholars who are challenging every day that, celebratory narrative about apartheid has ended and so now we're all free, and taking seriously the lessons from quote unquote post-apartheid South Africa and the unfinished revolution there, as well as the unfinished revolution in our own country and in our own island. And the work that the likes of Brendan have been tirelessly doing to emphasize that we can't just be exporting our perfect kind of peace process as a solution for Palestinians, that the fundamental problems with our own process, with partition as a non-solution, and even just going back to the point about neutrality and Shannon and all of that, like, it's important to mention as well. And this is not an insignificant footnote to it, but we thought, as important as the conversations are about the triple lock and maintaining Irish neutrality and all of that, we have to also be honest in saying that a part of Ireland is not neutral, is hooked into NATO membership through the British jurisdiction and the continuation of British rule in part of the island, and that is a not insignificant element of that. that discussion. And so, there is a lot of work to be done there around just, the comparative analysis and learning from each other to build that better understanding of what the future needs to look like for it to be what we want it to be. And then there's also, as Brendan said, the practical and logistical kind of elements about building genuine kind of connections and partnerships and institutional relationships beyond the significant but ultimately small kind of numbers of financial supports or scholarships that are currently there. And a lot of this, when we think about connecting to the other context that you mentioned, like there's been a lot of analysis obviously of the scholasticide in Gaza and the extent of the deliberate destruction of the university sector and spaces, and there's a serious conversation that all the international academic community as a whole needs to have about supporting the rebuilding and reconstruction in all of its many senses, physical and metaphorical, of the education system in Gaza, because it can't be just a case of, well, we'll just our response or responsibility will be to we'll create a sanctuary scholarship for one professor or person who's able to leave Gaza to come, and that will be our job done. It obviously needs to go a lot further and a lot deeper than that, and needs to recognize the importance of building and rebuilding from the starting point that the Palestinian universities and calls for action have articulated, and thinking about how that could, because if you think about some of the other examples that you mentioned, right, so if we take Sudan as one, a lot of the situation there is to do with resource access to resources and resource extraction, which again many of us are all complicit in every day, in the technologies and devices we use and the consumption patterns we engage in and all of that. But there's also there has been a deliberate kind of destruction of education systems in Sudan as well, as a form of scholasticide there, and it's recognizing some of the overlaps or similarities while also being conscious obviously of the difference and the different registers that we need to respond on. And like the Sudanese kind of regime or state universities are not receiving billions and billions of European research funding and preferential access to European projects and partnerships and all of that, but there is ways we can think about how our response there should be done, thinking about some of the overlaps and similarities, and ultimately the role of some of the regional forces as well. And the UAE has been very kind of directly complicit in funding and arming a lot of the genocidal violence in Sudan, as well as being the Arab regime that's been one of the most friendly and one of the most responsible for normalization with Israel. And so we can't see those things as disconnected either. And when Ghassan Kanafani used to talk about the trifecta, or the triangle of enemies facing the Palestinian people and the Palestinian liberation movement, and he always talked about imperialism and Zionism and the reactionary Arab elites and regimes, and sometimes he put the Arab regimes and reactionary elites first in that list, and that he's talking about that in the context of his the struggle he was involved in the late 60s in Palestine, or some of the historical analysis he was doing of the Arab national leadership elites in the 20s and 30s. But it's obviously very much true today as well. And so there's also important elements about connecting the dots there, and the because sometimes there's a tendency to say, well, the conflicts in Sudan or Congo are so complicated, we can't really understand it, and there's this reduction of it to like warring unexplainable warring tribal factions or whatever, which is again a product, it's a different type of media racism and embedded kind of societal racism that produces all these biases in the reporting of Palestine, but it is also a form of an expression of racism in its own way. And we, and again, I won't go into this in any level of detail, but like what's happened with the International Criminal Court speaks to this as well, because there was, for a long time, because at a certain point, the the US or other Western powers said there was a genocide happening in Darfur back in the earlier phase of the conflict in Sudan, it was okay then for the ICC to issue arrest warrants against a head of state in al-Bashir at the time in Sudan, and it was fine for the ICC to go after this African leader and head of state in that context and accuse him of genocide and so on. Whereas then when we come to the situation where despite for after 15 years of doing everything they could to avoid dealing with the Palestine situation, the ICC it was untenable not to do something. And so once the arrest warrants were issued for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, it was then all of this scrambling amongst the Western leaderships to find ways to say, well, that's we're not sure about that, or maybe the ICC is going too far there, or actually all those arguments we made about Bashir not having immunity and head of state immunity not being valid anymore. Maybe we were wrong about that, and actually Netanyahu does have immunity, and we couldn't really arrest him if he was to come and visit. That would be not something we could do. And you have the likes then of Lindsey Graham and some of the Trump figures in the US who just come out and say the quiet part out loud and explicitly and say, look, the ICC was not meant to be for us. It was meant to be for those lawless kind of African warlords. It was not meant to be for, and he said this explicitly, it was not meant to be for the US or for Britain or for France or for Germany. And so because of that, now we have to, it reflects all of the anti-colonial criticisms of the court for being this tool of Western hegemony in the first place. And they, are now willing to blow up the entire institution to protect Israel from any, even the remotest likelihood of any form of accountability. And so we have, the sanctions against the court, against the officials, and now even against the judges. And even within, who are the judges that have been sanctioned by the court, they're selectively choosing the judges mostly from smaller or global South states, and the judges who are involved in the same decisions against Israel or the US. If it happens to be a French judge, they're not going to sanction them. And so it's very clear how these things are working. And so part of the activism is joining up the dots and educating ourselves and being best equipped to respond in as forceful a way as possible.
Great, thanks for that, John, and thanks, Brendan. I saw someone commenting online in relation to Trinity College and divestment, and they were saying, oh my God, if we divest from Israel, where is this going to lead us? Who else are we going to have to divest from? There's so many social injustices going on around the world, state-sponsored and everything. And I was like, yeah, that is where we end up. There's so many horrendous things happening that you have to open your eyes to, and you can't close your eyes to it. Even here in Ireland, we have the situation for direct provision. But I think that what we've been talking about today and what both of you have centered today is about speaking up about these things and talking about them and raising awareness about them and speaking in your own space. So I just want to thank you both very much for that. Thank you for walking us through the scholarship and through your research and through your activism and through your teaching, and most of all for centering the Palestinian scholars and the Palestinian people in what we've been talking about today. So thank you both very much.
Gura Maha gave John, August Brendan, August everyone listening wherever you are. On next week's show, we hear from Dr. Emer and Stephen from Trinity College Dublin and Rita Sacker from Maynooth. We'll be talking about Emer's recent trip home to Palestine and the possibility of decolonizing Irish academia. We hope you join us then. Slán Abhaile.